You've also done investment banking when it comes to energy as well. So you have an idea about what it takes to actually make this stuff work. First, I just want to start big picture before we get to sort of your thesis about the smaller companies benefiting. Is Venezuela uninvestable, like Darren Woods says?
Yeah, Tim and Carol, thank you for having me. First of all, good to be back on. I think thinking about Venezuela, essentially there are two components of that story. Number one is historical component, and obviously Exxon, Conoco, and super majors had significant losses as a consequence of the nationalization in the kind of 2000s by Hugo Chavez, and those losses are in the range of 30 plus billion, with Conoco itself about 10 to 12 billion as a single company. So obviously
that's real money.
That is real money that is still being subject of negotiations, and I think companies, super majors, by definition, have to be cautious in entering back into a country like that. So that's thinking about sort of the historical component. Now, the current component, and I know you all mentioned, meeting at the White House, some of the oil and gas companies, there needs to be sort of a framework set of the companies going back into a territory like Venezuela. I know there was some ask about, U.S. guarantees in terms of some of the super majors specifically going back into Venezuela. Obviously, Venezuela, it is the country with the largest oil resource on this planet, with about 300 billion barrels. Even before Saudi Arabia with about 260 billion barrels. So very significant resource. I would say the other piece that's going to play a role is obviously oil prices themselves. I mean, right now we are right about $60. If you think about the history, and again some of the very similar examples, I would say Exxon, for example, their operations in Guyana. They entered the country securing their position in 1998, and it really took them until 2015 to drill their first well, and that was in a oil price environment that was at $140 for periods of time. So oil price is certainly going to play a role, because if you want to take that risk and go back into a country like Venezuela, you really need to see a sort of higher sustained oil prices.
Andrejka, one thing, yeah, that's what I want to get to, the smaller players, because if some of the big players, the major integrated oil companies, are a little suspect and cautious, because with good reason, some of them have been burned, and we're talking about billions of dollars already at risk that they've seen. How is it that smaller companies, who I think it's safe to say their balance sheets are more fragile, that they would be in a position to benefit maybe in this situation when it comes to Venezuela?
It's a great question, Carol. We have really good sort of examples in the region itself, in the form of Colombia and Argentina, for example, where in Colombia, you did see some of the smaller players entering the country and really, showing the ability, one, to be more entrepreneurial, two, find sources of capital that may be more of a sort of, willing to take some of that risk, like large, family offices, et cetera. And we are certainly seeing that in the market, from our perspective today.
You're seeing family offices that are willing to risk exposure to building out the Venezuelan energy infrastructure.
We have seen that for a while at this point, Carol. So yes, obviously, a lot of the oil and gas or natural resources or mining specific family offices that, have been in the territory of historically, putting money on the line and taking significant risk, and frankly, building ultra large family offices as a consequence of that sort of exploration or counter risk are, going to be probably very interesting and maybe unexpected, to your point, players potentially, sort of scooping the territory and maybe being, even the first entrance back into Venezuela.
But it sounds yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
One more component that's interesting, obviously, Venezuela, this is a figure that's been quoted a number of times in the past couple of weeks, but 8 million of the population of Venezuela is outside of Venezuela. A large portion of that population is highly educated. engineers and geologists and finance people, etc. So, you have a very competent workforce that knows the region, has worked in the region before, maybe outside of the region, and may have the ability to attract capital. Again, maybe some of those ultra large family offices to get back into the region. So having the combination of the risk appetite of some of the large family offices and a workforce, that may be able to attract that capital, knows the region, could be a very interesting combination.
As somebody who follows the oil market closely and has worked in the industry, I'm just curious about just general demand trends and what you think they will be. When does demand peak in your view? I mean, 20 years ago, we were talking about peak oil. We obviously didn't reach that, and a lot has shifted since then. When do you think demand peaks, and when are we sort of on the other side of that hill where we see like less demand? Because these investments, these are decades.
Yes, 100%. And it's a great question, Tim. And we think about this deeply. I mean, I remember being a young analyst, at Blackstone, and we had conversations 20 years ago about peak demand, and really, nothing has materialized, to your point. In our opinion, what's interesting trajectory is kind of the interconnectivity of oil and gas. And obviously, one of the biggest topics right now globally is pushing the boundaries of inventory and the cost of actually, extracting oil. Being pushed obviously upwards. So, our thesis is, slightly, I think, differentiated. We are on both sides of the story, on oil and gas side, as well as the renewable side. And so naturally, as you guys are going to see renewable pricing coming down and oil extraction prices, break-even prices coming up, that's sort of where we see the territory where demand for oil and gas is going to slow down, and we're going to see the intersection of those two. So whether it's 5 years or 10 years or 20 years,